Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. Father James Martin did not set out to become a Jesuit priest. Growing up, he was an average kid with average dreams. But in his 20s, working in a corporate job, he made a huge change in his life. Father Martin has become known around the world for giving voice to Catholics who are often excluded from their church, including those in the LGBTQ community. He was a confidant to the late Pope Francis. He's also editor-at-large of America magazine, which is run by Jesuits. And his new book is about all of that and a whole lot more. It's called Work in Progress, Confessions of a Busboy, Dishwasher, Caddy, Usher, Factory Worker, Bank Teller, Corporate Tool, and Priest. Father James Martin, good morning.
Good morning.
You write in this book that you weren't, and it's obvious, but you weren't always a Jesuit priest. Who was James Martin before that?
Well, as you said, just an average kid. I grew up outside of Philadelphia in a small town called Plymouth Meeting. My family was Catholic, but not super religious. And, went to public schools, went to public high school, went to the University of Pennsylvania, studied business, got a job at General Electric, and, thought that was going to be my path for the rest of my life. But, God had different ideas, I guess.
You also did a lot of the things that young people do. You smoked a lot of weed and you drank a lot of beer.
Yes, I did.
Should we be surprised by that?
I don't think so, because that's what other kids did. As I said, I wasn't always a Jesuit priest. I think if I had left it out, my friends would have said, you're leaving out an important part. But I think it's important to show that God can be at work in anybody's life, even a busboy or, someone who gets high during college or even a Jesuit priest.
How do you look back on that person that you were then? It's always interesting to see, and when you write a book like this, I would assume that there's a lot of that looking back in the rearview mirror. How do you see that person, that young person now?
I think with a lot of wistfulness, also gratitude for all the experiences I had, for my family, for the friends I had, with some forgiveness for some of my escapades that are detailed in the book. Interestingly, as part of the research for this book, I ended up using a journal that I'd kept when I was 15 years old in 1976, which I found a couple of years ago. And so I had an experience of sort of encountering myself in an unmediated way. And I think all of us, have ideas of what we were like when we were teenagers. But boy, to really see it, in black and white was something of a shock.
Now, forgiveness is an interesting thing to think about in terms of who that person was.
Yeah, I talk about some things that I did that I wasn't proud of. I say at one point in the book that I look upon myself, when I was 17, the way that an adult would look at any 17-year-old, right, with a mix of compassion and hope and forgiveness, because I wasn't always perfect, and, still I'm not always perfect.
When you think of things that you weren't proud of, some of this, I think, might come to your relationship at the time with your faith. You've called yourself at that point sort of a lukewarm Catholic. What was your relationship with God like then?
Pretty transactional in the sense that I thought that if I were a good boy and did X, Y, Z, then God would reward me. I think that's the way it continued until really my 20s. And I think that's the way a lot of people think about God. If I believe in God, and I think this is how I was thinking back then. I believe in God, and I think I need to be a good boy and then a good young man. And if I were those things, then I would be rewarded appropriately. But that really takes away God's freedom. It's basically treating God like a big gumball machine. You put in a penny, and out comes the gumball. The idea that God would have freedom and agency was something that was beyond me at the time.
One of the things that you say about that time is that, and you've hinted at this, you believed in God, but you didn't know if God believed in you. What do you mean by that?
Well, I believed in God as a sort of distant reality, but the idea that God would take an interest in me, that God would communicate with me, I thought at the time was arrogant, right? Who am I? And borderline delusional. What am I, hearing voices? And it wasn't until I entered the Jesuits that I started to see ways that God has of communicating with us and, in sort of kind of gentle, quiet, subtle ways. But when I was growing up, God was just this distant, sort of quasi-mythical figure. Again, I believed in God, but, as I say in the book, I didn't know what God's relationship with me was.
What changed when your friend Brad was in a car wreck? Tell me a little bit about him and what you went through given his experience.
Yeah, so Brad was my freshman year roommate at Penn. We were very close. And between junior and senior years, he was killed in a car crash with another friend. And I remember at his funeral in Potomac, Maryland, sitting in the pew thinking, I'm done with God, that's it. I don't believe in a God that, kills my friends, or I don't want to believe in a God that kills my friends. And I persisted in that unbelief or sort of atheistic or agnostic state for a couple of months until a friend of mine really brought me up short. And when I talked to her about this, my friend Jackie, she said, well, I've been spending the last few months thanking God for Brad's life. And it really marked a shift in my life because it, in a sense, invited me to think about God, a relationship with a God that I didn't understand, right? That even though you don't understand God's ways or why things happen, you can still be in relationship with God, even if it's, being angry with that God or thanking God for, graces in the midst of tragedy. So Jackie's comment really changed my life.
After that, you were always a reader, and you talk about always being a reader. And reading was key to you becoming a Jesuit priest because you were reading Thomas Merton, right? You'd seen something about him on television and then were reading about him.
I came home one night in the middle of my unsatisfying job at General Electric in Connecticut, and I turned on the TV, and this documentary about Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, was on, and it just captivated me. I just thought, who is this guy? And monastic life in a monastery, and life as a priest, it just seemed so beautiful and purposeful and romantic in a way. And that prompted me to go out and track down and read his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, which, again, changed my life. Just that encounter with that TV show and the encounter with the book. And it, in a sense, invited me to consider a life that I'd never really even thought existed.
What changed in that moment? People talk about those lightning bolt kind of incidents. What, in reading that, changed you?
Well, I think it was something of a push and a pull. There was a push out of GE. I really was unhappy with my job. Business is a vocation for many people, but it wasn't for me. So there was this push out. I was looking for something. And I think when our defenses are down and we're vulnerable, as I was, we're more open to God's invitations. God can break in more easily. And I turned on that TV that night, and it just spoke to me, right? It wasn't anything mystical. I didn't, hear voices or see visions, but I just felt this real powerful longing for the kind of life that Thomas Merton led. So that was the pull. There was a push out of GE, and there was a pull towards religious life and life as a priest. And I just sort of blindly groped around and found my way to the Jesuits eventually.
You said you entered the Jesuits because of what they did, but you stayed because of who they are. What does that mean?
Well, that's right. When I first encountered the Jesuits, a Catholic religious order, also known more formally as the Society of Jesus, I think people know the most for our schools and whatnot. I was really struck by the fact that you could be a Jesuit priest or brother and be an astronomer and be someone who works in a soup kitchen and be a parish priest, a retreat director, university professor. I thought that was great. What kept me in the society was the spirituality of finding God in all things and the way that the Jesuits relate to the world and relate to the church and relate to God. And so what we do is certainly still important, but it's really who we are and how we are before God that really was the glue that kept me in. And of course, then I took vows, and so I made a promise that I would stay in. But that's really what made me stay in the novitiate. I thought, boy, this is a wonderful way of life.
That chapter of your life it's the end of this book. Much of the book is about the things that you did leading up to that and these jobs that you did as a dishwasher, a caddy, delivering a newspaper that people didn't want, and then having to go and knock on their door and get money from the people who didn't want the newspaper so that they could pay for the newspaper. What did you learn from all of that?
Oh my gosh, I list a lot of those life lessons at the end. Certainly working hard. My parents instilled a great work ethic in me and my sister. And then small things, showing up on time, asking for help when you need help, being okay with not knowing how to do something, being kind to people, treating people with dignity, and then just listening, right? And trying to pay attention to people that you're working with. I would say the most fundamental lesson, though, was about working hard. That's one of the reasons it's called Work in Progress. It's a sort of progression of my my jobs, my works throughout my life, all the way back to, being a paperboy at age 13. You learn a lot when you're when you're collecting and when you're trying to aim and the aim doesn't go right and, people don't want to pay you. And, you learn a lot about persistence and hard work.
What did your dad say? That it's hard because it's work. If it was fun, it would be play.
I told him, I came in once. He used to say this all the time. I came in, I said, "This is no fun." And he said, "Of course it's not fun. Why do you think they call it work? If it were fun, they would call it play." That sort of rings in my ears.
The kindness thing is really important, and that runs through so much of your work. You said that you learned a lot about being mean and about not being mean. There's a lot of meanness, it feels like, in the world right now. How do you understand that?
Well, it's a choice, isn't it? I mean, the book's pretty lighthearted in terms of the summer job experiences, but there were a couple of experiences there where I was humiliated and made to feel small, and it instilled in me a kind of allergic reaction to that. I mean, I wouldn't choose to do that anyway, but I'm sort of almost physically unable to do that, to treat people, poorly or to humiliate them. I would never do that. But it really inoculates you against that kind of activity, if you're treated like that. So that's the first thing. I think we see that increasingly in the world, on the world stage, but also individually, certainly online. And it's a choice, right? I mean, for the Christian, it's, you can choose to be a kind person and merciful and forgiving and compassionate like Jesus is, or you can choose not to be. And I think when we choose not to be, that's when we move into sin. And we see what happens sort of, when it's universalized.
Why do you think people do that?
Human nature, right? Sin. I mean, we're not perfect. I think sometimes it's done out of fear, right? I have to be mean to you because I'm afraid that, in a sense, my status is being challenged or my status is in jeopardy. But yeah, it's plain old human nature and plain old sin, and we really have to work against it. I learned from people humiliating me, but also me not being kind to people who I think I should have been kinder to. I talk about a couple people in the book. And then finally, looking at people in my life, even as a teenager, who were very kind to people. I saw it almost like as a superpower, right? They were kind to people who were on the margins. They were kind to people who were not cool. And I used to look at my friends and think, gosh, I wish I were like that. And that's been, one of the paths of my life, to move away from being selfish and self-centered to being more compassionate and, I hope, more loving.
How does that steer the work that you do? You just use the word margins, and you've spoken often about finding God in the margins. What does that mean?
Well, first of all, it means looking at what Jesus did, which was always going to the margins and seeing people who were excluded or ignored or rejected by society or by religious leaders sometimes. In my own work today, I do a lot of work with LGBTQ Catholics, who really are the most excluded people in the church. And so as a Jesuit in formation or in training, those are the people that we spend time with, right? I won't tell you all the different ministries I had as a Jesuit, but, to take two of them, I worked with Mother Teresa's sisters in Kingston, Jamaica, helping to care for people who were dying on the streets. They would bring them in from the streets, and we took care of them. And then for 2 years in Nairobi, Kenya, working with refugees, helping them start small businesses. I mean, these are really people who are rejected, by their own countries or have to flee. And that really prepared me for this work with LGBTQ Catholics. But really, it comes down to trying to follow what Jesus asks us to do, which is really going out to these people who feel rejected, excluded, or in any way marginalized.
You worked closely with Pope Francis, who was a big supporter of your work in supporting members of the LGBTQ community in the church. You met with Pope Leo in September. How did Pope Leo respond to that work? Is he as supportive?
Yes, the message I got from him is that he wants to continue Pope Francis's approach of welcome and inclusion. And, he met with me for 30 minutes and I felt completely supported and uplifted and really consoled. I have to say, I think he's just he's a great choice. And I think the Holy Spirit did a great job.
He has also made a point of speaking out about the dignity of migrants and is in past has criticized the policies when it comes to deportations and immigration broadly of the Trump administration. How do you understand where that comes from?
Well, it comes from the Gospels. Oftentimes people think that Pope Leo or Pope Francis or before him Benedict or John Paul are being political. They're being religious. In the Gospels, Jesus says very clearly in Matthew chapter 25, basically when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me. You welcome Jesus. And when you don't welcome the stranger, you don't welcome me. And this theme of welcoming the stranger, the alien, the refugee, goes all the way back to the Old Testament. You shall not oppress the resident alien, says God to the people of Israel, because you yourselves were aliens once in the land of Egypt, right, during the Exodus. So this is a consistent theme through both the Old and the New Testaments. And when Pope Leo is talking about respecting the dignity of migrants and refugees, he's talking about the gospel. He's talking about Jesus. So we have to remember that he's not being political. He's being religious. He's being Christian, and he's being Catholic.
Is it not inherently political to say that at a time when people are being snatched off the streets and sent into deportation camps and flown off to countries that they have no ties to?
Interestingly, I would say no. I don't think it is inherently political. I think it's inherently religious. It's inherently Christian, and it's inherently Catholic.
It happens to be political?
And if I beg your pardon?
It happens to be political then, if it's not inherently?
Mm-hmm. If you stand up and preach about forgiveness in the street and people sort of walk by you, it's because it may not be something that's on their minds. If you stand up in the street and talk about migrants and refugees and people start to pay attention, it's because it happens to be on their minds, politically. But you're saying the same thing. And obviously it has political implications. I'm not trying to deny that. But what I'm saying is he is speaking a Christian message, which I think is really important to see because people tend to try to box the Pope in or box the bishops in politically, but they're being good Catholics.
I'm not trying to box you in here, but is your sense that Catholics like J.D. Vance are listening to that message right now?
I have no clue what he's listening to.
Do you hope he's listening to that message?
I certainly hope he is. From their actions, I would say, it doesn't seem that they are really putting it into effect.
Is that the choice that you were talking about earlier? I mean, I'm not saying that it's meanness, but a lot of people have characterized it as meanness, but those actions are ones that are a choice.
Absolutely, and I do think it's meanness. I think it's cruelty. Rounding people up. I worked with refugees in East Africa, right? These are people who need a home, right, who need people to care for them and who are trying to make a good life for themselves and their families. They're very unselfish. And rounding them up, humiliating them, beating them, killing them, putting them into what are essentially concentration camps, right, is cruel and is mean and is unchristian. And, the bishops have said this in the United States. The Pope has said this. And it's up to, politicians and legislators to listen or not, right? This is a choice that they have.
It's easy to say that in your country, but other countries as well, that there's real division and polarization. You can see that on social media. You can see that in the way that politics is played. There was an editorial that I read recently in Axios, and it talked about that polarization. And it said at the end of it, the bottom line, the next time your screen tells you America is broken, close it, walk outside, talk to your neighbor, coach the team, go to the town meeting. That's the real America. It's a hell of a lot better than the one being manufactured for clicks, clout, and cash. Do you think that's the real America? Is America in this moment not the polarization that we see writ large in the headlines and on social media?
I would say they're both America, right? I mean, social media is a reality, and it does affect how people think, and so we can't ignore it. But I think that's a good insight, that you can't be wrapped up in it, because it will warp your mind. The key is really listening to people. It's respecting them for who they are. It's trusting that they're trying to do their best. It's getting to know them as friends first. I participated in the Synod of Bishops over the last couple of years, and one of the quotes that was used was from St. John Paul II, and it's a great quote. And the quote is, affective collegiality precedes effective collegiality. So what does that mean? Affective collegiality, meaning you have to be friendly and friends with people and know them. It precedes any discussion of difficult topics. And so the invitation first for all of us is to become friends and to love one another, and certainly not to begin by demonizing one another. So it's very difficult, right? But it's essential.
I was going to say easier said than done in this
Absolutely.
moment.
Yeah, it's tough work.
How do you in this moment not get consumed by despair? You've talked a lot about despair, and you say that it can be a reasonable response to life, but it makes us less grateful. It feels like a really bad time in many different aspects right now. And you could imagine people turning to despair just because that's a natural thing to do. You pull the sheet over your head and you don't get out. How do you not fall prey to that?
Well, the main way is by focusing, for me as a Christian, on the resurrection. So if you think about the disciples on Good Friday or Holy Saturday, Jesus has been executed. Their leader is done. It looks like everything is over. They're, hiding behind closed doors, and they think that's it. But God has other things in mind, right? I mean, that's what Easter shows us. I think the message of the resurrection is hope is greater than despair, right? And that hope is always coming from God and despair never is. Despair says that God can change nothing, right? And it's a little bit of an arrogant way of thinking, right? Nothing can ever change. Whereas hope encourages us to continue and encourages us to believe that things can change. I mean, something simple as the election of Pope Francis. No one ever thought a Jesuit would be elected Pope or that he would do any of the things that he ended up doing. And look at Pope Leo. People thought, an American could never be elected Pope. I'm not saying that's the antidote to despair and that everybody, was happy about Pope Leo's election. I certainly was. But it does show us that things can change and can change quickly, thanks to God. So despair just, basically leads to, as you say, staying in bed with the covers over your head, which doesn't help anybody and, least of all you.
It's hard, though. I mean, that's difficult to get to that point. For people who are living through this moment right now, war and talk of war, and those divisions that we were hinting at, however acute they might be, that can be a really hard place for people to land on.
Oh, it's totally difficult. Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult. It's hard to, pull the covers down and get out of bed, right? But it's a kind of act of trust, for the religious person in God, that God is with us. And again, what's the alternative? The alternative, giving up, doesn't help anybody, and it doesn't help you. So I think it's a very Christian response, but it's a very human response to want to move away from despair.
Just finally, there's a line in this book that stands out, and it speaks in some ways to how you've lived your life, but some of the things that you've talked about. And the line is that grace works through all our lives. What does that mean?
It means that no matter who you are, that God is at work through you. Right? And that grace is at work through your life. And the key is being attentive, being aware, and just noticing. I think we tend to think that grace is at work only in, lives of religious people, but no, it's in everybody's life. And the key is, again, just paying attention.
So if people aren't spiritual in the broadest sense or even in the most specific sense, where can they find that grace? Where can they see that grace?
I think by asking yourself, where have I seen God's presence in my life? Where have I encountered God moving through my life in relationships and in work and nature and art? For the non-religious person, I think, perhaps it's looking at, it's funny, I don't think in those terms, so it's sometimes hard for me to speak to that community. But, I would say, where do I see signs of hope, signs of uplift, right? Signs of movement, signs of progress.
Beauty and wonder and all those things too.
Yeah, and awe, right? I mean, again, I'm speaking as a religious person, but I think for someone who's not religious to say, where is the universe kind of calling me to my best self, right? And that's never in despair. It's always in hope.
I really enjoyed this book. We know a lot about you, but it's also just really interesting to read about the person who was you before you became the person that we know, if that makes sense.
It does.
Father James Martin, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Father James Martin. His new book is Work in Progress, Confessions of a Busboy, Dishwasher, Caddy, Usher, Factory Worker, Bank Teller, Corporate Tool, and Priest. You've been listening to the Current Podcast. My name is Matt Galloway. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.